Hi there, welcome to lecture 3. In this lecture we're going to be looking at the origins of Proto-Indo-European or Indo-European languages, and then we'll try and look at what evidence there is for mythology, Indo-European mythology, how that's preserved in the language and in various European and Indian myths, and then seek to see to what extent there's an astronomical basis to the myth. So it's quite a complicated lecture. I'm going to try and make this a bit easier to understand than the last ones where I was clicking through the slides and losing my voice, so I'm trying not to say anything when I click through a slide. So let's see. So basically I'm going to split this lecture into a few sections. So first off, I'm going to be looking at the origin of the language, what we mean by Indo-European. Then in the second part, I'll be looking at where we think the language group started. So there's two possibilities there that are generally put forward. Then I'll start to look at how I've managed to attempt to trace the myths. So it's looking at the different forms of the myths to try and find a proto-myth from which the later myths sprung. And then having identified these earliest myths, I'm then, which are the cosmogony, that's the creation myth, and the next one is the cattle theft. So those are the two basic myths that I will reconstruct, and then I will attempt to show how both of these myths, the cosmogony and the cattle theft, have their roots in astronomy. And as soon as we can work out their astronomical roots, we can start to explain what they mean, date them, and suggest where they arose and what the later meaning was. So we'll start off by asking, what do we mean by Indo-European languages? Well, the clue is obviously in the term. These are languages which are spoken in Europe and the Indian subcontinent, and they are believed to have arisen from a single original source, which we call Proto-Indo-European. The question is when. We're looking anywhere between 7,000 and 2,500 BC. So we're looking way back. The origin perhaps at the start of the Neolithic period, or the start of the Bronze Age period in about 2,500. Now, to explain these languages are very widespread. I'll try not to make too much noise as I do this. But the languages it covers are most of the languages of the Indian subcontinent, all the way across to Britain and up to Scandinavia. There are, however, a number of languages which are not Indo-European, and it's easier to explain which those ones are, rather than list the whole of Indo-European languages. So the ones which aren't Indo-European and which are probably survivals from a earlier Neolithic, even earlier hunter-gatherer set of languages, these are Basque, which are there, Hungarian, so there's Hungarian there, or Magyar as it's known, Estonian, which is up here, Caucasian, which is over to the east of the Black Sea, and then the Finno-Ugric languages, which are up here, Finnish. So it's just a handful, really, of survivals of languages which aren't Indo-European. So a very small number. The rest of the languages of Europe and Asia, Southeast Asia, the Indian subcontinent, are all derived from this Proto-Indo-European, and it's believed that the languages had a single point of origin and then spread, bringing both the language and culture with it. Now the question is, what was that culture? Did they bring farming, this is Colin Renfrew's position, which we'll talk about later, or did they bring metalworking in the Bronze Age? There are a lot of different subjects different ways of trying to work out when the languages spread and what sort of manner of culture. So archaeology, genetics, linguistics, these are all subjects that are used to try and discern when the Indo-European languages spread. So, we're used to Indo-European languages, especially sort of English and Spanish, are the two most popular spoken languages in the world. I think the Mandarin has more speakers, but in general, the Indo-European languages are spoken over more of the world than any other. But here's a depiction of the Indo-European family tree. And actually, you can see it's just, if you look at this image at the bottom, of all languages, it's only a small kind of minor branch of the languages spoken over the whole world. They've just, by historic accident, are those which are most widespread being spoken at the moment. Now, from Proto-Indo-European down here, the languages spread, and we can trace this spread in the same way that we can trace a family tree. We can look at how the languages have changed over time, forming the different branches. There are four main branches, as you can see down here. Actually, the best diagram is the next one, so I'm going to go on to that one. This shows the spread of the languages from the original Proto-Indo-European, wherever that originated, which is the next question. So we have a number of different branches of the Proto-Indo-European family tree. Ours, English, is off the Germanic branch, and we're actually, English is down here, where we are a Western Germanic branch of Proto-Germanic. Most of the other languages of Europe come off different branches. So the Scandinavian languages sort of come off the Germanic. But we have the Celtic languages here, which gave rise to Welsh and Gaelic, and these are still surviving in parts of Britain. And then we have the Italic language group, which gave rise to Latin, and from Latin it then later, is a word changed or mutated into what we now call the Romance languages, which means the language of the Romans. So French, Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, Romanian, these languages are all derived from Latin. And in fact, if you learn Latin, it gives you a good basis in going on to learn these other Romance languages. There are then other branches, such as Hellenic, which gave us Greek, and then Baltic and Slavic. Slavic gives us Russian. And then lost branches such as Tocharian. Now, Tocharian is, I think there's a handful of words in Tocharian, and that was a branch of the language that had almost reached China. I won't go into that today, but it shows the massive spread of the language group. Now, the realization that these languages were all one really came about through study in the 17th century onwards. Linguists started realizing that certain words, such as the numbers, or words for animals and food and what have you, in a lot of different language groups seem to be related to each other as if they had all arisen from the same source. So this was the idea of the study of languages. Now we have a list here of our numbers and then the original reconstructed Indo-European terms. Now we have different scholars who have reconstructed different sort of proto-words. These proto-words all have an asterisk at the beginning to show that they're reconstructed, that they're assumed to be correct, but there's no way of proving it. We just assume that, for instance, our word 3 did come from a proto-form tree or tries, hence the asterisk. Now, scholars have even gone as far as to try and write stories in what they call the reconstructed Proto-Indo-European language. I'm not going to read all of this out. I'll read the first paragraph just to give you an idea. But this is called Schlieker's Fable. Schlieker was a linguist, German linguist, who wrote a story in what he called Proto-Indo-European. And the first paragraph is: Gorhir hawis quesio wulnia est, equon speced hoinem ke gorum vocum wacontum, hoinem ke meum porum, hoinem ke kmen hocu perontum. Which apparently, if you were living 3000 BC on the Russian steppes, you would have been able to translate as: on the mountain, a sheep that had no wool saw horses, one pulling a heavy wagon, one a great load, and one swiftly carrying a man. There's a number of different versions of Schlieker's Fable available. If you Google them, you have other better linguists than me reading out the fable and showing you what this language might have sounded like. So there's a question of when the language group arose. Now, language seems to change at a steady rate over time. Now, English, for instance, I mean, it's different nowadays because of mass communication and writing. But before the advent of writing, which kind of concretizes and fossilizes a language to some extent, but before the advent of writing, languages would tend to change, diverge at a set kind of rate. And scholars looking at, say, the American Indian languages, where there's about 400 of them, knowing roughly, they thought, when people first arrived in the Americas, which was then thought to be sort of 10,000 BC. This may be changing. Traced the development and changes in the language groups and came up with a number of sort of set laws, the time it would take for language to change, and the sort of changes of sounds that would happen. So there are a number of linguistic laws that show how changes occur. So, for instance, a T sound will change to a D over time and then disappear. Now, this is something it's just a natural occurrence due to the shape of the mouth and the tongue. So, for instance, English butter becomes budder in American, and then in certain sort of southeastern English dialects becomes butter. So a T can become a D and then disappear. So water becomes water in South English kind of estuary dialect. And there are a number of other changes like this. So these are linguistic laws that we can use to show how language changes and then reconstruct how they used to sound. But as I said, the languages change over time. So over every, say, 1,000 years, a speaker of a language will probably fail to understand the same language how it was spoken a millennia earlier. So, for instance, we can understand Shakespeare in English, with a bit of help, because that's only 400, 500 years old. Go back to 1,000 years when we're looking at late Old English, Anglo-Saxon, and it becomes very difficult to understand what's being said. Here's a line of Old English, and you'll understand it only because you know the context. So it's Fadar urða og ört on heavenum see thy nama gehalgod. So it's our Father who art in heaven, holy be thy name. So we know that because we know the modern translation. But if we didn't know the translation, we might have a bit of a problem understanding what these words were. Obviously, we have things like nama for name. Heavenum is quite similar. Earth for earth. The is the same, and father. But go back even further, and the languages become even more incomprehensible. So, using these techniques, scholars have been able to try and gauge when the language split, when Proto-Indo-European first arose. And so we have a number of laws. I'm not going to go into them, such as the Anatolian split and the Sartem and the Ruki rule and all this kind of stuff that Indo-European scholars have come up with to try and explain and to suggest a starting point. And this starting point seems to be somewhere around 4,500 BC. Maybe earlier, maybe later. But this is, in general, we would say that Proto-Indo-European is thought to have been spoken 4,500 BC and then split somewhere around 4,000, 3,000 BC. Question then arises from where and what this says about the culture and what sort of cultural traits it brought with it. Now, in trying to reconstruct it, we are helped because the lexicon itself contains certain words that we can help to show where it might have arisen. So there's no words for tiger, camel, and monkey. So it doesn't look like it's sort of North Africa or India, for instance. No name for olive, palm, desert, rice. Funnily enough, there's also not much evidence for gold, silver, and iron. So it's it looks like it's a pre-Iron Age split. So we're perhaps looking at Bronze Age or earlier. Nothing really to suggest coastal origin either. So we're perhaps looking at somewhere that's landlocked. What we do find are these kind of words. So we're probably looking at more temperate climate, perhaps forested landscape. So, it could be anywhere sort of Central Europe. Now, this is a map that has been produced showing if we put on the lexicon and we try and work out where the language might have arisen, then this is Mann and Killian's idea that it was actually sort of in the region of Poland, given the lack of an availability of certain sort of animals. So it's not sort of north of here because there are no hedgehogs north of there. Also, sort of, it's not going to be over in the Urals because there aren't bees over here. That kind of thing. Now, this isn't set in stone. Obviously, you can say, well, there's no olives, so it didn't arise down in the Mediterranean. But then again, if the language did arise here and it moves over here, they're not going to be growing olives in Scandinavia, so that the word will disappear. These kind of linguistic hints, they're just clues. They're not set in stone. For instance, all the countries here have a word for coffee, very similar words for coffee, cafe, what have you. It doesn't mean that coffee existed in Proto-Indo-European times, or that the language only spread since the discovery of coffee. You have to be careful when you're using these reconstructive systems that they're not set in stone, and you have to be careful. So there are two main ideas of when the languages arose. Now, the first is the so-called Kurgan hypothesis, which I'll talk about next, and that argues that the spread occurred sometime around 3,500 BC from the Russian steppes, that's sort of north of the Black Sea. And this was a Bronze Age, early Bronze Age spread, and it involved the spread along with the domestication of the horse, the use of wheeled chariots and wagons. This is the usual interpretation, but there is another interpretation which I mentioned, and that is from Colin Renfrew. He argues that the spread perhaps occurred earlier with the Neolithic, with the spread of farming from Anatolia in about 6,500 BC. One of the suggestions that this may be correct is the fact that the Indo-Europeans called themselves the Area. It's a name that unfortunately has connotations after the Second World War, but Area just means the ploughmen, and so it's possible that it did spread with farming. Now, these are questions which we will look at next. Is it that the languages spread with farming or with domestication of the horse in the sort of secondary later Neolithic and early Bronze Age? And these are questions which are still raging. The majority of people believe that it's a later spread because of the number of words in the lexicon that are to do with secondary Neolithic production, sort of milk and sort of all the words to do with wheels and wagons and horses. But then, like coffee, could these words have just spread afterwards? That is a question that needs to be solved. So the two main protagonists, as I said, are Colin Renfrew in his Archaeology and Language. This was written, I think, in the 80s now, so it's quite an old book. And probably the best defense of the Kurgan, the later sort of Bronze Age horse riding hypothesis, is David Anthony in his Horse, a Wheel and Language, and this came out in, I think, 2007, 2009, somewhere around there. So it's a more recent work. And he uses the evidence of words that have cognates with sort of horse riding and the use of wheel transport to show that the language is spread from one place that had these cultures already existing, that already had the technology of horse-drawn carriages. So he reconstructs a Proto-Indo-European root word for wheel, for instance, which is it's keklos, or becomes kweklos, and then we get wheel from that. There's also another word, similar word, rota, which gives the Latin rotas, or rotary. It's also axe for axle, a word for thill, which is the pole between the two horses or oxen, whoever are pulling the wagon, and wegeti, meaning to ride, where we get the word wagon from. It's the thing you ride on. And Anthony has shown where these different words appear in the language groups of Europe and India. And this useful map here shows that we have all the words appearing, for instance, in the Indian languages, and this Tocharian, this very early and now extinct language group, all the words appear there. But even all the way over in Scandinavia, we have, in the Germanic languages, most of the words associated with this culture appearing quite clearly derived from the similar language, the same language group as these others. So the question is, where did they arise from? Anthony will argue that they will arise from somewhere that has these cultural traits, that has domesticated the horse and has wheeled transports. And archaeologically, that looks to be the first place in Europe that domesticates the horse are the Russian steppes. And that is a question that we will look at next.